The first human ever invited into the royal palace of the Aurelian Empire was not a diplomat. Not a soldier, not a scientist, and definitely not someone the galaxy considered important. He was a maintenance worker with grease under his fingernails, burned scars on both hands, and a habit of saying things no sane person would ever dare say aloud near royalty, which was exactly why the entire throne chamber fell silent the moment. Elias Vale looked directly at Princess Seraphel of House Valer and quietly said, "You look lonely." Nobody breathed after that. Not the armored guards lining the silver walls. Not the nobles seated beneath floating banners of blue fire. Not even the translators hovering beside the throne. Because in the Aurelian Empire, loneliness was considered shameful. Rulers were meant to embody perfection, eternal confidence, divine superiority. And emotional weakness was treated almost like a disease, especially within the royal bloodline. And yet this exhausted human from a mining station, at the edge of civilized space, had looked at the most feared princess in the galaxy and spoken to her as if she were simply another tired person trying to survive another day. Princess Seraphel stared at him with eyes the color of collapsing stars. Cold, sharp, unreadable, her silver robes flowing behind her like liquid moonlight. She sat perfectly still upon the elevated throne, while dozens of military commanders waited for her to order the humans' execution, because lesser beings had died for far smaller insults. One senator had once disappeared for merely suggesting the princess seemed stressed during a negotiation. Another noble family had been erased from historical records after spreading rumors that Seraphel refused marriage proposals because she could not trust anyone near her. The Empire feared her, respected her, obeyed her. But nobody truly knew her. Nobody dared. Elias did not seem impressed by any of that. "You should kneel," one guard hissed through clenched teeth. "I already did," Elias replied calmly, gesturing toward the toolbox near his boots. "For 6 hours, repairing your overheating gravity conduits." Several nobles looked horrified. The princess slowly rose from the throne. The movement alone enough to make trained soldiers stiffen in fear. She descended the silver steps with impossible grace until she stood directly in front of the human mechanic. Towering slightly over him, her expression unreadable. The chamber lights reflecting against the thin crown woven into her white hair. "And what," she asked softly, "would make a human believe he understands me?" Elias shrugged. "Because everyone in this room looks terrified of saying anything honest to you," he answered. "That usually means a person stopped hearing real conversations a long time ago." The silence somehow became even heavier. One commander reached for his weapon. Seraphel lifted one finger without even looking at him. The commander immediately froze. Elias should have been afraid by then. Every survival instinct should have forced him into apology. But humans had earned a strange reputation across the stars. They were not the strongest species, not the smartest, not the fastest. Yet they possessed an almost suicidal honesty that made alien civilizations deeply uncomfortable. Humans spoke to generals like workers laughed during disasters, and occasionally treated powerful rulers like ordinary people. The galaxy called it arrogance. Humanity called it being tired of pretending. Seraphel studied him for several long seconds. Then something impossible happened. The princess smiled. It was small, brief, almost fragile, but the effect on the room was catastrophic. Nobles exchanged stunned looks. Guards visibly shifted in panic. One elderly advisor nearly dropped his translation device. Because most people in the Empire had never seen the princess smile at all. "You are either very brave," Seraphel said quietly, "or profoundly foolish. Probably both," Elias admitted. Another faint smile touched her lips before disappearing. "Come with me," she said. The entire chamber erupted into confusion. "Your Highness," one advisor protested immediately. "The human has not been security screened for private royal proximity. He repaired the palace core while your engineers argued for 12 hours. Seraphel replied without turning around. "If he wished to kill me." He already had the opportunity. Nobody answered that. Elias picked up his toolbox and followed her through the massive silver doors, while hundreds of stunned eyes watched in disbelief. Because nobody in living memory had ever been personally invited into the private wing of the imperial princess, especially not a foreign laborer wearing a stained utility jacket. The royal corridors were quieter than Elias expected. Impossibly beautiful, but quiet in the wrong way. Massive windows revealed endless stars beyond the palace station. Sculptures floated in controlled gravity fields. Soft blue light illuminated ancient murals depicting Aurelian victories stretching back thousands of years. Yet despite all the beauty, the place felt empty. Not physically empty, emotionally empty. Like a museum built to honor people who had forgotten how to live. "You were serious?" Elias said after several minutes. Seraphel glanced sideways at him. "About what you really are lonely." Most beings would have denied it instantly. She did not. "That word," she said carefully, "is not spoken openly among my people." "Why?" "Because rulers are not supposed to need anyone." Elias snorted softly. "That sounds miserable." She looked genuinely surprised by the response. "You speak about imperial tradition very casually." "Yeah," Elias answered. "Humans usually do that with things that make no sense." For the first time in years, Princess Seraphel laughed out loud. It echoed softly through the empty corridor and somewhere deep inside the palace. Ancient servants quietly stared at each other in shock. The truth was that Princess Seraphel had not experienced a normal conversation in almost 11 years. Not since becoming heir to the imperial throne after her older brother died during the Varkesian Rebellion. Before that, she had once been curious, energetic. Even rebellious by Aurelian standards, but grief inside royal families rarely remained private. Her brother's death transformed her from a daughter into a weapon. Advisors hardened her. Generals trained her. Nobles surrounded her with endless caution until eventually every interaction became calculated. Formal, distant, people no longer spoke to Seraphel the person. They spoke to the future empress, and after enough years even, she forgot the difference. Humans changed that accidentally, not humanity as a government. Because the Terran Union barely mattered politically. Earth sat far from the Empire's central systems and possessed neither ancient fleets nor economic dominance. But humans themselves spread everywhere through labor contracts, engineering jobs, exploration missions, and independent shipping companies. They were loud, adaptable, stubborn, and dangerously difficult to intimidate. Aurelians considered them socially exhausting. Seraphel secretly found them fascinating, especially Elias Vale. He followed her into a circular observation chamber overlooking the stars. There were no guards inside, only silence, a single table, and a panoramic view of endless galaxies burning across the void. "This room belonged to my brother," Seraphel said quietly. Elias set down his toolbox carefully. "You miss him?" "Yes." "You still talk to him in your head sometimes?" Her eyes narrowed slightly. "How do humans keep doing that?" "Doing what?" "Seeing things people try to hide." Elias leaned against the wall. "Because humans spend most of our lives hiding things too." Seraphel studied him in silence. "You have lost someone as well." "My wife," he answered simply. The princess blinked. Nobody in the Empire would have spoken about personal grief that directly. "I'm sorry," she said carefully. "Yeah," Elias replied softly. "Me too." The stars reflected in the chamber windows, while silence settled between them. But unlike the suffocating silence of the throne room, this one felt strangely comfortable after a while. Seraphel asked, "What was she like?" Elias smiled faintly. "She laughed at terrible jokes, hated cold weather, and once punched a cargo pirate with a wrench because he insulted our ship." The princess stared at him for several seconds before another unexpected laugh escaped her. "She sounds dangerous." She was terrifying. "And you still speak about her with affection." "Of course, in our culture," Seraphel said slowly, "excessive attachment after death is considered weakness." "That's because your culture is emotionally constipated." Seraphel nearly choked on her drink, for the first time in many years. The princess forgot to behave like royalty, and she liked it far more than she should have. News spread through the palace within hours. The human mechanic had insulted imperial traditions, made the princess laugh, entered the private observatory, and somehow survived. By the following morning, half the station was discussing him in whispers. Some assumed Seraphel planned to interrogate him. Others believed she intended to recruit him. Several nobles suspected something far more dangerous, that the princess enjoyed his company, which terrified them. Because loneliness made rulers predictable, isolated people depended on systems, traditions, advisors, but connection changed people. Emotionally connected rulers became harder to manipulate, and many powerful families within the empire benefited greatly from Seraphel's isolation. Lord Kelith especially. Lord Kelith especially, the oldest surviving member of the Imperial Council, watched the situation with growing concern. He had served the royal family for over 40 years, guiding policies, influencing military contracts, maintaining political balance, and while he publicly praised the princess, privately he preferred her emotionally detached. Detached rulers relied heavily on advisors like him. A human changing that dynamic represented a threat. Especially a human who spoke honestly, Kelith summoned Seraphel the next evening. The council chamber smelled faintly of incense and old metal. Ancient banners hanging above a polished black table, while senior officials watched silently. The human has become a topic of unnecessary discussion, Kelith began carefully. Seraphel remained calm, because the court lacks meaningful hobbies. A few advisors looked uncomfortable. Kelith forced a diplomatic smile. He lacks proper respect for imperial protocol. He repaired the palace reactor after your engineers failed repeatedly, Seraphel replied. I value competence more than theatrical obedience. He is emotionally manipulative. That statement finally earned a visible reaction. Seraphel's eyes hardened. Explain. Kelith folded his hands. Humans possess a history of exploiting emotional vulnerabilities among alien powers. Their species thrives through social integration. Perhaps unintentionally, but the result remains dangerous. You are suggesting, Seraphel said slowly, that a maintenance worker has infiltrated the imperial court through friendship. Several council members avoided eye contact. Yes, the princess stood. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop instantly. For years, she said quietly, you advised me to suppress emotion, isolate myself, trust no one, and present endless perfection to the empire. And now one honest conversation with a human frightens you more than enemy fleets. Nobody spoke. Kelith carefully maintained composure. You misunderstand our concern, no? Seraphel replied coldly. I finally understand it perfectly. She left without another word. The council chamber remained silent long after the doors closed, because everyone present realized something fundamental had shifted. Princess Seraphel was beginning to think for herself again. Meanwhile, Elias had absolutely no idea he was causing political chaos. He spent most of his time inside engineering sectors repairing ancient systems palace technicians were apparently too important to touch personally, which irritated him endlessly. You people run half the galaxy, he muttered, while crawling beneath an overheating coolant conduit. But nobody taught your engineers how to tighten bolts properly? That statement borders on treason, said a voice behind him. Elias slid out from beneath the machinery and found Seraphel watching with clear amusement. You keep sneaking up on people, he complained. You are inside a royal palace, still creepy. The princess looked down at the open machinery panels. You truly enjoy this work. It makes sense, Elias answered, wiping grease from his hands. Machines break for logical reasons, people break for stupid ones. That may be the most human sentence I have ever heard. Thanks, I think. Seraphel crouched beside the damaged conduit despite several nearby attendants looking horrified. Explain this system to me, Elias blinked. You actually want to know? Yes. For the next hour, he explained coolant cycling, pressure regulators, emergency bypass systems, and maintenance shortcuts used across frontier stations. Seraphel listened with genuine curiosity, occasionally asking surprisingly intelligent questions, while nearby servants quietly stared in disbelief at the sight of the future empress sitting on the floor beside a human mechanic discussing pipe failures. You really were trapped in that throne room too long, Elias finally said. What makes you say that? Because you look happier learning about broken cooling systems than attending royal ceremonies. She opened her mouth to deny it, then stopped because he was right. The realization unsettled her more than she expected. Over the following weeks, their conversations became routine. Seraphel found excuses to visit engineering sectors, storage decks, maintenance corridors, places nobody expected royalty to appear. While Elias gradually stopped treating her like a legendary imperial figure and more like an unusually overworked woman carrying too much responsibility, he made her laugh constantly, not politely. Not strategically, genuinely. Once, during a diplomatic banquet, he leaned toward her and whispered, "Why do all your nobles look like they're attending a funeral?" causing the princess to nearly choke on ceremonial wine in front of 12 ambassadors. Another time, he asked why royal armor included decorative shoulder spikes. "So enemies know where to stab easier." She laughed hard enough to leave the room. The palace staff became increasingly alarmed because Seraphel was changing. She started dismissing unnecessary ceremonies. She questioned outdated traditions. She spent less time isolated inside private chambers. Most disturbingly of all, she began speaking honestly. When a noble praised a failed military initiative merely to protect political alliances, Seraphel openly called the strategy incompetent. When advisors attempted emotional manipulation through ceremonial obligations, she refused. When Keleth suggested limiting civilian access to lower station districts after a labor protest, Seraphel personally visited the workers instead. And every time someone asked what caused these sudden behavioral changes, the answer remained painfully obvious: the human. Lord Keleth decided Elias Vale needed to disappear, not publicly. Public execution would create unnecessary attention, especially after rumors spread across nearby systems about the princess's strange friendship with a Terran mechanic. Humanity itself might even react unpredictably. Humans rarely won wars against larger powers, but they possessed a terrifying tendency to become impossible enemies once emotionally invested. No, the situation required subtlety, a station malfunction, an unfortunate accident, something believable. Keleth arranged everything personally. The explosion occurred during third cycle maintenance beneath the lower reactor district. Elias was inside Conduit Sector 9 when emergency alarms erupted across the station. Red warning lights flashing violently while automated systems screamed evacuation orders. "What the hell?" Elias muttered, grabbing a diagnostic scanner. Then he saw the pressure readings. Someone had intentionally overloaded the fusion stabilizers. If the chain reaction reached the primary core, millions aboard the palace station would die. Including Seraphel, Elias ran. Not away from danger, toward it. Because humans were strange like that, sprinted through smoke-filled maintenance tunnels while engineers evacuated in panic. The entire sector trembling violently from secondary explosions. "You can't go in there," one technician shouted. "Watch me." The reactor chamber looked like hell. Blue plasma fire erupted across shattered conduits while emergency barriers struggled to contain rising energy surges. Elias immediately understood the problem: manual shutdown. The automated systems had been sabotaged. Someone would need to reach the central regulator physically, which also happened to be directly beside the unstable plasma vent, meaning whoever attempted it probably would not survive. Elias swore quietly, then started climbing. Above the reactor sector, Princess Seraphel stood frozen inside the emergency command center while officers shouted conflicting status reports. Containment failure approaching critical threshold. Civilian evacuation incomplete, engineering teams unable to access manual override. Then another voice broke through the chaos. "There is one individual still inside the reactor chamber." Seraphel felt sudden dread. "Who?" The officer hesitated. The human mechanic. For the first time in years, genuine fear crossed the princess's face. "Get him out." "We cannot," another officer answered helplessly. He sealed the blast doors manually. Seraphel turned toward the surveillance display and saw Elias climbing through burning wreckage toward the unstable regulator core. "Idiot," she whispered, not angry, terrified. Inside the reactor chamber, Elias reached the damage control assembly, while alarms screamed around him. Radiation burns spread across his arms from exposed plasma vents. The regulator wheel refused to move. "Of course you're stuck," he muttered through clenched teeth. He braced both hands against the wheel and pulled harder. Metal screamed, energy surged violently, then the regulator finally shifted. The entire reactor station shuddered Warning alarms abruptly stopped. Core stabilization restored. Millions survived. Then the plasma vent exploded. The blast threw Elias across the chamber hard enough to crack reinforced alloy panels. Everything went black. Princess Seraphel arrived in the medical wing less than 4 minutes later. Doctors, soldiers, and attendants immediately moved aside as she entered. Elias lay unconscious inside a regeneration chamber, severe burns covering most of his body. Multiple fractures visible beneath medical scanners. He absorbed direct plasma exposure, one physician explained carefully. No unshielded being should have survived. But he will. The physician hesitated. We do not know. Seraphel stared silently through the glass. The thought hit her suddenly, violently if he died. The palace would become empty again, and the realization hurt far more than she expected. She remained beside the chamber for 11 consecutive hours. Advisors requested meetings. She ignored them. Military commanders demanded strategic decisions. She delegated authority. Lord Keleth attempted personal audience access. She denied him immediately. The Empire watched in growing shock while the future Empress sat beside an injured human mechanic refusing to leave. Eventually, Elias regained consciousness. His first visible reaction was confusion, then annoyance. Why does my entire body feel on fire? Seraphel laughed softly despite exhaustion. You were exposed to a reactor explosion. Oh, Elias muttered weakly. That explains it. She moved closer to the chamber. You nearly died. Yeah, he admitted, not ideal. The princess studied him carefully. Why'd you do it? Elias looked genuinely confused by the question because people would have died. You risked yourself for an empire that barely respects your species. Still people, Seraphel felt something tighten painfully inside her chest. Aurelian nobles constantly spoke about honor. Sacrifice, glory, yet most protected status above all else. This exhausted mechanic with no political power had willingly walked into death for strangers. No calculation, no ambition, just because he believed it was the right thing to do. Humans were terrifying, not because they conquered galaxies, but because they cared so recklessly. 3 days later, the investigation uncovered evidence of sabotage. Hidden command overrides, altered maintenance logs, financial transfers connected to private council accounts. Seraphel personally led the inquiry, and eventually every trail pointed toward Lord Keleth. The confrontation happened inside the Imperial Council chamber. Keleth remained composed even after armed guards surrounded him. You endangered millions, Seraphel said coldly. I protected the Empire by murdering civilians. By removing a dangerous influence, the princess stepped closer. You tried to kill him? Keleth finally dropped diplomatic restraint. Yes, he snapped, because he changed you. Silence filled the chamber. You became unpredictable. Keleth continued bitterly. You questioned traditions, ignored political balance, connected emotionally to lower citizens, all because one human mechanic convinced you loneliness was weakness. Seraphel stared at him without expression, then quietly answered, No, she said. He convinced me loneliness was not strength. Keleth's expression hardened. You are future Empress, I am also alive. The old counselor looked almost disgusted. That distinction destroys rulers. Seraphel's voice became deadly calm. Perhaps it is time the Empire stopped worshipping broken rulers. Keleth was arrested moments later. The political aftermath spread across the Empire like wildfire. For the first time in generations, a member of the Imperial Council had been publicly exposed for manipulating the throne. Even more shocking, the princess openly defended a human citizen against aristocratic power. Many nobles considered it scandalous. Ordinary civilians considered it inspiring. And humanity watched everything carefully. Terran networks began circulating footage of Elias leaving the medical wing beside Princess Seraphel, the exhausted mechanic limping slightly while the future Empress walked beside him without visible royal escort. Online reactions across human systems became immediate chaos. She likes him. That man accidentally flirted with an alien princess and survived. Humanity finally weaponized emotional support. Even Elias found the situation ridiculous. "You realize my species is turning this into memes," he informed Seraphel one evening. "I do not understand memes, honestly. Neither do we anymore." She smiled faintly while standing beside the observatory window. The stars reflected across her silver eyes. "You changed the Empire," Elias said quietly. "No," Seraphel answered. "You did. Pretty sure all I did was call a princess lonely. That required courage few beings possess." Elias leaned against the window beside her. "Or stupidity, yes," she admitted softly. "Perhaps both." For several moments neither spoke. Then Seraphel asked the question she had avoided for weeks. "Will you leave?" Elias looked at her carefully. "One day?" The answer visibly hurt despite her attempt to hide it. "You belong among stars and empires," he continued gently. "I fix broken machinery, you fix more than machinery." The words escaped before she could stop them. Elias fell silent. Seraphel turned away slightly. "Before you arrived," she admitted quietly, "I had forgotten what normal conversation felt like. Every interaction became performance, every relationship transactional. Everyone feared me or wanted something from me. And eventually I stopped believing connection was even possible anymore." Elias listened without interruption. "But you," she continued, "spoke to me like a person, not a throne. Because you are a person, that idea becomes difficult to remember inside palaces." He studied her for several long seconds, then said softly, "You know what I think, what? I think the galaxy built a cage around you and convinced you it was a crown." Seraphel felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. Nobody had ever described her life so accurately. Not advisors, not nobles, not even herself. Just a mechanic from Earth standing beside a window full of stars? Humans really were dangerous. Weeks passed, then months. The Empire slowly adjusted to its changing princess. Seraphel reduced aristocratic privileges, expanded labor protections across outer systems, established direct civilian communication councils, and began personally visiting districts previously ignored by royalty. Public approval skyrocketed. Traditional nobles quietly panicked. Meanwhile, Elias continued repairing station systems, because apparently saving millions from reactor explosions still did not excuse him from maintenance schedules. "You know," he complained while replacing damaged conduit relays, "heroes should get better benefits." "You received a private royal suite," Seraphel reminded him. "Yeah. And it has 12 decorative pillows for some reason. They are ceremonial." "They're aggressively ceremonial." She laughed again. The sound no longer shocked palace staff, though many still stared. One evening, during a diplomatic gathering, a foreign ambassador cautiously approached Elias. "You possess remarkable influence over the princess." Elias nearly dropped his drink. "Buddy, I once accidentally locked myself inside a cargo bathroom for 6 hours. I promise you, I'm not masterminding imperial politics." Seraphel overheard the conversation and actually covered her mouth, trying not to laugh. The ambassador looked deeply confused. Good. The galaxy deserved confusion. Because somehow, against all logic, an emotionally exhausted alien princess and a widowed human mechanic had become the most talked-about relationship in known space. Not officially romantic, not politically defined, just deeply important to each other, which frightened powerful people far more. Then the assassination attempt happened, not against Elias, against Seraphel. The attack occurred during a public address on the lower civilian decks. Exactly the type of appearance previous royal heirs avoided entirely. Thousands gathered around elevated platforms while security forces monitored crowds carefully. Elias stood near the rear maintenance access because he disliked formal ceremonies. Then he noticed something wrong. One security officer moved incorrectly, too tense, too deliberate. Humans survived dangerous worlds partly because instinct evolved faster than logic. Elias reacted before conscious thought fully formed Seraphel. The disguised assassin drew a concealed plasma weapon. Elias moved instantly. He slammed directly into the princess just as the weapon fired. Blue plasma bolts tore across the platform, crowds screamed, guards rushed forward. Elias and Seraphel crashed hard against the metal floor, while additional shots exploded overhead. The assassin never fired again. Imperial security eliminated him within seconds. But Seraphel barely noticed, because Elias was bleeding. A plasma round had burned across his shoulder during the impact. "You got shot," she said sharply. "Technically grazed," Elias groaned. "Still counts as annoying, though." The princess looked furious enough to start wars. Not at the assassin, at the possibility of losing him. Medical teams arrived immediately, while civilians watched in stunned silence. Then something extraordinary happened. Seraphel ignored royal protocol completely. She held his hand the entire way to the medical transport. Publicly, in front of everyone, the footage spread across the empire within hours. Future Empress of the Aurelian Empire, abandoning royal composure beside injured human mechanic. Political commentators lost their minds. Asterisk traditionalists called it disgraceful. Younger citizens called it beautiful. Humanity collectively lost all remaining chill. "Oh my God, they're in love" became the most repeated phrase across Terran networks for nearly 48 consecutive hours. Elias considered fleeing the galaxy permanently. "You know," he muttered later from a medical bed, "this is somehow worse than the reactor explosion." Seraphel sat beside him, looking almost amused. "You dislike attention?" "I repair pipes for a living?" "Yes," she said softly. "Yet you continue changing history accidentally." He looked at her carefully. "Was holding my hand really necessary?" She met his eyes without hesitation. Yes, the answer silenced him completely. For the first time since his wife's death, Elias felt something inside his chest shift painfully. Not replacement, never replacement, but possibility, which terrified him. Seraphel noticed the fear immediately. "You do not need to answer anything," she said quietly. "I know you still carry grief." "Yeah," she nodded slowly. "So do I." That was the strange thing about them. Neither healed the other through perfection. They understood each other through damage, through loneliness, through loss. The galaxy expected legends to be larger than life. But most real connections formed between wounded people trying their best not to break completely. Several weeks later, Seraphel invited Elias onto the palace exterior observation deck during artificial night cycle. Very few individuals received access there. The stars stretched endlessly around them, while distant ships moved like glowing insects across the void. "It is beautiful," Elias admitted. "It is quiet. Different kind of quiet, though." Seraphel leaned against the railing beside him. "When I was young," she said softly, "I used to sneak here with my brother. We would watch civilian traffic and invent stories about travelers." "What happened? He died," she answered simply. "And everyone else decided childhood was no longer appropriate for me." Elias looked toward the stars. "People do that after loss," he said quietly. "They stop treating grief like pain and start treating it like a job." She turned toward him slowly. "How do humans keep understanding impossible things?" "We're good at being disasters emotionally." Another small laugh escaped her. Then silence returned, not uncomfortable. "Never uncomfortable anymore?" Finally, Seraphel spoke again. "When you called me lonely," she said carefully, "I almost ordered your execution. Fair. But part of me also wanted someone to say it." Elias studied her expression. "You know what the worst thing about loneliness is?" "What? It convinces you nobody notices." The princess looked away quickly, because suddenly her eyes burned. No speeches, no politics, no ceremonial perfection. Just honesty beneath the stars. Then Elias gently added, "I noticed that nearly broke her. Princess Seraphel of the Aurelian Empire had negotiated wars, commanded fleets, survived political conspiracies, and faced assassins without visible fear. Yet one quiet sentence from a human mechanic threatened to destroy every emotional wall she spent years building. Because deep down, more than power, more than glory, more than imperial destiny, she had simply wanted someone to see her, and he did. The following year transformed the empire. Seraphel officially ascended the throne after the aging emperor retired due to illness, becoming the youngest ruling empress in nearly 2 centuries. The coronation attracted delegates from hundreds of worlds. Military fleets filled surrounding sectors while billions watched across interstellar broadcasts. Tradition demanded emotional distance during the ceremony. Absolute composure, perfect authority. Instead, the new empress shocked the galaxy during her first official address. Strength, Seraphel declared before countless worlds, is not isolation. Strength is not emotional silence. Strength is not forcing ourselves into loneliness because tradition fears vulnerability. Across the palace, many nobles looked horrified. Meanwhile, Elias stood near the engineering observation balcony, wondering how his life became this absurd. Seraphel continued, "For too long this empire treated connection as weakness and compassion as liability. That era ends now," her voice carried across entire star systems. "We do not become lesser by caring for one another, we become stronger." Human news networks immediately exploded with reactions. One headline simply read, "Human mechanic accidentally fixes empire." Honestly, not entirely inaccurate. After the ceremony, Seraphel escaped the endless diplomatic chaos and found Elias inside a maintenance corridor repairing a damaged service drone. "You abandoned your own coronation," he said without looking up. "You abandoned it first. Fair point." She watched him work for a moment, she said softly. "Most rulers receive ancient weapons or sacred relics after becoming empress. And what did you get? A maintenance worker with emotional opinions?" Elias laughed quietly. "Sorry about that. I am not." The simplicity of the answer settled between them. Then Elias finally asked the question both avoided for months. "What happens now?" Seraphel considered the stars visible through the corridor windows. "Now," she said carefully, "we attempt something extremely dangerous." "What's that?" She looked directly at him, being happy. Elias stared at her for several long seconds, then slowly smiled. "Yeah," he said softly. "That does sound dangerous." The galaxy never entirely understood the relationship between Empress Seraphel and Elias Vale. Some historians described it as political transformation. Others called it cultural revolution. Human media mostly called it proof that emotionally exhausted women apparently loved sarcastic mechanics. But the truth remained simpler. A lonely princess spent years trapped behind power. Then one human looked at her without fear, without worship, without calculation, and dared to say the one honest thing nobody else would. "You look lonely." That single sentence changed an empire. Because sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is notice another person hurting. And sometimes the bravest thing is saying it aloud. Especially when speaking to someone the entire galaxy fears. Years later, children across imperial worlds learned stories about the human mechanic who made an empress laugh. Workers repeated his reactor sacrifice like legend. Soldiers admired his recklessness. Nobles still complained about him constantly, which probably would have made Elias proud. But among ordinary citizens, the most famous part of the story was never the political reform or assassination, attempts or imperial speeches. It was the idea that even the most untouchable person in the galaxy could still feel alone. And that being seen mattered one night long after the coronation. After diplomatic crises and political reforms and endless responsibilities faded temporarily into silence, Seraphel stood once more beside Elias in the observatory that once belonged to her brother. The stars burned endlessly beyond the glass, Elias said thoughtfully. "If someone told me 2 years ago I'd end up emotionally supporting an alien empress, I probably would have checked them for brain damage." Seraphel smiled against his shoulder. "And if someone told me I would someday fall in love with a human mechanic who insults ceremonial pillows, I would have ordered psychological evaluations." "Reasonable response?" She laughed softly, then rested comfortably beside him while silence settled around them. Not the cold silence of isolation, not the painful silence of grief, just peace. The kind, lonely people spend entire lifetimes searching for. Far beyond the palace windows, fleets crossed endless galaxies. Civilizations rose and fell. Stars lived and died in burning oceans of cosmic fire. But inside that quiet observatory, none of it mattered very much. Because for the first time in years, neither of them felt alone anymore.